Poland, September 1939. Just after 400 hours, the rumble of engines became a roar, shattering the pre-dawn quiet. German panzer divisions, spearheaded by the 1st Light Division, surged across the border, their advance an unstoppable tide. This sudden, brutal thrust, later termed Blitzkrieg, relied on speed and shock, aiming to cripple enemy resistance before it could fully mobilize, thereby minimizing the duration of conflict and, crucially, the logistical burden. The stakes were immediate and existential for Poland, but for the Wehrmacht, they represented a gamble on a new form of warfare, one that prioritized momentum over traditional supply chain robustness. General Heinz Guderian, a visionary of armored warfare, watched from his command vehicle, a converted SD KFZ-251 half-track, as his tanks devoured the distance. His tactical doctrine, developed over years of meticulous study and daring experimentation, centered on deep penetration and encirclement. He understood that the inherent weakness of such an approach lay in its reliance on an unbroken rapid advance, which naturally outran conventional supply. Yet, the initial successes were so profound, so utterly devastating to the Polish defenses, that concerns over stretched lines seemed almost theoretical, a distant academic worry. The speed of the advance was unprecedented. Daily situation reports from the field indicated forward elements covering 50 to 80 kilometers in a single day, a pace that left the slower, horse-drawn supply echelons far behind. Fuel consumption alone for a single panzer division engaged in combat operations could reach 100,000 liters per day, a figure that dwarfed the capacity of the nascent motor transport columns. Ammunition expenditure, while initially low due to the swift collapse of resistance, would escalate dramatically in sustained engagements, a factor largely unaddressed in the euphoria of early victories. Early logistical planning, as evidenced in Generalstab des Heeres directives from August 1939, focused primarily on pre-positioning supplies at railheads near the border. The assumption was that the campaign would be short, measured in weeks, not months, and that captured enemy infrastructure and stores would supplement German efforts. This reliance on improvisation and the enemy's collapse became a foundational, yet ultimately fragile, pillar of the Blitzkrieg strategy. The sheer speed of the advance, while tactically brilliant, began to create a growing chasm between the front lines and the depots, a chasm filled only by the dwindling reserves carried by the fighting formations themselves. The initial Polish campaign, lasting just over 5 weeks, offered little opportunity for these logistical vulnerabilities to fully manifest. The enemy's rapid disintegration meant that German forces rarely faced prolonged, attritional battles that would exhaust their onboard supplies. Fuel trucks, often commandeered civilian vehicles, struggled to keep pace, but the sporadic nature of resistance allowed for brief pauses, just enough time for critical resupply. These early, seemingly minor, logistical hiccups were dismissed as growing pains, an inevitable consequence of such a revolutionary form of warfare. The Wehrmacht command, observing the swift collapse of Poland, solidified its belief in the efficacy of the Blitzkrieg. The strategic implications were profound: a short, decisive war, minimizing the need for a protracted industrial effort to sustain a vast army in the field. This triumph reinforced a dangerous complacency, a conviction that the sheer momentum of their armored spearheads would always outrun the logistical problems they inherently created. The laughter in the general staff, however muted, echoed a confidence built on a foundation of rapid but ultimately unsustainable success. The invasion of the Soviet Union, commencing in June 1941, fundamentally altered the logistical calculus for the Wehrmacht. Operation Barbarossa projected an advance across a landmass that dwarfed any prior German military undertaking, stretching supply lines to their absolute operational limits and beyond. The initial swift armored thrusts, designed to bypass and encircle, created vast distances between the frontline units and their railheads, a problem exacerbated by the deliberate Soviet scorched earth policy. The sheer scale of the Eastern Front rendered the logistical planning, largely predicated on the more compact Western European campaigns, immediately insufficient. German railway gauges differed from the wider Russian standard, necessitating a massive and continuous program of track conversion or transshipment at every railhead. This bottleneck alone consumed an enormous amount of engineering effort and rolling stock, diverting resources that were already stretched thin. Fuel consumption, a critical vulnerability, escalated dramatically as panzer divisions pushed hundreds of kilometers deeper into Soviet territory. A single armored division could consume upwards of 600 cubic meters of fuel per day during an active advance, a volume that required hundreds of trucks to transport from the nearest railhead. The road network, where it existed, was often unpaved and turned to impassable mud during the autumn rains and spring thaws, further crippling motor transport. Ammunition and spare parts, though less voluminous than fuel, faced similar transport challenges. Production logs indicate that while German factories maintained impressive output, delivering these supplies to the forwardmost units became an increasingly desperate endeavor. For instance, a single 88mm anti-aircraft, anti-tank gun round weighed approximately 15 kilograms, and a battery of these guns could expend several hundred rounds in a single engagement. Transporting these necessities over vast, hostile terrain with inadequate infrastructure placed an unbearable strain on the logistics corps. The human cost of this logistical overreach was profound. Soldiers on the front lines frequently experienced shortages of food, winter clothing, and medical supplies, directly impacting morale and combat effectiveness. Interrogation files from later in the war consistently highlighted the pervasive issue of inadequate supply as a primary factor in the declining fighting spirit of German units. The initial laughter at Allied logistical perceived shortcomings had long since faded, replaced by the grim reality of their own supply lines, which were now perilously extended and increasingly brittle. Occupied France, August 1943. A staff car, a black Mercedes 770 Grosser, moved swiftly along a tree-lined avenue, its polished chrome reflecting the dappled sunlight. Inside, General Feldmarschall Gunther von Kluge, commander of Army Group B, reviewed intelligence summaries, his brow furrowed not by concern for Allied capabilities, but by the persistent nuisance of partisan activity disrupting rail lines far behind the front. The reports detailing Allied supply convoys across the English Channel were often dismissed with a sardonic chuckle in the high command. A collective belief that the sheer scale of the undertaking, the vast distances involved, and the inherent inefficiencies of coalition warfare would inevitably cripple any sustained offensive. This underestimation, born of a deep-seated conviction in German operational superiority, would prove to be a fatal miscalculation, directly impacting the strategic decisions that followed and ultimately determining the fate of the Western Front. The German military doctrine, honed over decades, emphasized rapid, decisive maneuver and the swift exploitation of breakthroughs, a strategy that placed less emphasis on the protracted, grinding logistics of attrition warfare. Their own supply chains, while effective for short, sharp campaigns, relied heavily on captured infrastructure and local requisitioning, a system ill-suited for a prolonged, multi-front conflict against an industrial superpower. Interrogation files from captured German officers frequently reveal a dismissive attitude towards Allied logistical planning, often characterizing it as overly cautious or inefficient. One captured Oberst, during an interrogation in July 1944, stated with a sneer, "They move like elephants, slow and ponderous." This perception, while perhaps true in a tactical sense compared to the Blitzkrieg's initial thrusts, entirely missed the strategic implications of sustained, overwhelming material advantage. The Wehrmacht's own logistical framework, while impressive in its initial execution, began to show critical fissures as early as the Eastern Front campaigns. The reliance on horse-drawn transport for a significant portion of its supply needs, particularly in the vast, road-poor territories of the Soviet Union, created bottlenecks that often stalled advances. Production logs from 1942 show that while tank and aircraft output remained high, the manufacture of heavy-duty trucks and specialized logistics vehicles lagged, a consequence of strategic priorities that favored combat arms over support elements. By 1943, the daily fuel consumption for a single panzer division on the move could exceed 100,000 liters, a demand that increasingly strained an already overextended supply network struggling with dwindling oil reserves and Allied bombing campaigns targeting synthetic fuel plants. This internal vulnerability was largely ignored or rationalized by the High Command, who instead focused on perceived Allied weaknesses. They viewed the sheer volume of Allied shipping, visible in reconnaissance photographs, not as a sign of overwhelming capability, but as a target-rich environment for U-boat attacks, believing that a sufficient number of sinkings would cripple any invasion attempt. Damage reports from the Atlantic U-boat Command, while showing intermittent successes, consistently failed to achieve the sustained attrition rates necessary to significantly impact the flow of Allied supplies. The strategic implication of this oversight was profound. German defensive planning, particularly for the Atlantic Wall, focused heavily on repelling the initial landing, underestimating the Allies' capacity to sustain and reinforce a beachhead with an inexhaustible flow of men and materiel. The German intelligence estimates for Allied logistical capacity, often based on pre-war assumptions about British and American industrial output, consistently underestimated the scale of their wartime mobilization. Production logs from American factories detailing the output of Liberty ships, landing craft, and military vehicles painted a picture of industrial might that dwarfed anything Germany could achieve. The sheer volume of material flowing across the Atlantic, sustained by an increasingly effective convoy system, was a testament to a different kind of war-making, one where industrial capacity and logistical efficiency were as crucial as tactical brilliance. This fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's strength, coupled with an inflated sense of their own operational invincibility, set the stage for a prolonged conflict they were inherently unprepared to sustain. The summer of 1941 had been a season of unprecedented advance, but as September bled into October, the Russian autumn began its inexorable transformation. The unpaved roads, baked hard by months of sun, dissolved into a quagmire of deep, clinging mud, a phenomenon known locally as Rasputitsa. This was not merely inconvenient, it was a fundamental alteration of the battlefield, turning every kilometer into a struggle against the very earth. German logistical planning had largely underestimated the impact of this seasonal change on their mechanized forces. The standard Opel Blitz 3-ton truck, the backbone of their supply effort, possessed limited ground clearance and a 2-wheel drive system ill-suited for such conditions. Its narrow tires churned hopelessly in the viscous muck, often sinking to the axles, requiring hours of manual labor with shovels and logs to extricate. Unit reports from Army Group Center in late October detailed a dramatic decrease in the effective range and speed of supply convoys. A journey that might have taken a single day in dry conditions now consumed 3 or 4, if it could be completed at all. Fuel consumption soared as engines strained, and wear and tear on transmissions and differentials escalated, leading to a higher rate of mechanical breakdown. The rail network, while more robust, was hampered by the fundamental difference in gauge between German and Soviet lines. The monumental task of converting captured tracks or transshipping all supplies at break-of-gauge points created bottlenecks of immense proportion. By November, the daily tonnage of supplies reaching forward units had plummeted, creating critical shortages of ammunition, fuel, and winter clothing. Interrogation files from captured German officers later revealed a recurring theme. The initial dismissive attitude towards the primitive Russian infrastructure had given way to a grudging respect for its capacity to impede. The Wehrmacht's reliance on rapid, motorized thrusts, which had served them so well in Western Europe, became a liability when those thrusts stalled in the mud, far from their railheads. As November deepened, the mud began to freeze, ushering in the brutal Russian winter. Temperatures dropped to unprecedented lows, often reaching -30 degrees Celsius. This new environmental factor introduced a fresh set of logistical nightmares, exposing further deficiencies in German equipment and preparation. Lubricants designed for temperate climates solidified, rendering engines inoperable until painstakingly thawed with blowtorches or open fires, a dangerous and time-consuming process. Vehicle batteries, not built for such extremes, lost their charge rapidly, and antifreeze was in critically short supply, leading to burst radiators and cracked engine blocks. Medical logs from the Eastern Front in December 1941 documented a surge in cold weather casualties, with thousands of cases of frostbite and exposure. The lack of adequate winter uniforms, a consequence of the belief that the campaign would conclude before winter, meant soldiers were fighting not only the enemy, but also the elements. Ammunition, particularly artillery shells, suffered performance degradation in the extreme cold, with propellants burning inefficiently, reducing range and accuracy. Weapons, too, often seized up as moisture froze in their mechanisms, demanding constant maintenance and rendering them unreliable in a firefight. The sheer scale of the logistical effort required to sustain an army of millions across such vast, hostile terrain in winter conditions was beyond the Wehrmacht's established capacity. Their system, optimized for short, decisive campaigns, buckled under the sustained pressure of an endless front and an implacable environment. The laughter had ceased, replaced by the gnawing chill of scarcity. The industrial might of the Allies, particularly the United States, began to manifest with an overwhelming force that fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. By 1943, American factories alone were producing a staggering volume of war material, a scale unmatched by any other nation. This output was not merely a matter of raw numbers, but also of logistical innovation and an unprecedented capacity for rapid deployment across vast distances. Production logs from Detroit and other manufacturing hubs reveal that by mid-1943, the United States was turning out an average of 6,000 tanks per month, alongside 8,000 aircraft and 120,000 trucks. These figures dwarfed the combined output of the Axis powers, whose industrial base, already strained, was further fragmented by Allied bombing campaigns and resource scarcity. The sheer scale of American manufacturing meant that even with the attrition of combat, a continuous and growing stream of equipment could be directed to multiple theaters simultaneously. The challenge then shifted from production to delivery, a task that the Allied logistical apparatus embraced with equal vigor. Shipping manifests from New York and Halifax ports document the departure of convoys carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of material weekly, protected by an increasingly effective anti-submarine warfare effort. The Liberty Ship program, a marvel of mass production, saw vessels being constructed in as little as 4 days, with an average turnaround time of 42 days from keel laying to launch. This rapid construction facilitated the transport of over 200 million tons of cargo across the Atlantic by the war's end. These vessels, once landed, fed an intricate network of supply depots, rail lines, etc., and motor transport units that pushed material forward to the front. The Red Ball Express, established after the Normandy landings, became a symbol of this logistical prowess, moving an average of 12,500 tons of supplies daily along a 700-mile circuit. This continuous flow ensured that Allied units, unlike their German counterparts, rarely faced critical shortages of ammunition, fuel, or spare parts, even during rapid advances. The German High Command, initially dismissive of Allied logistical capabilities, particularly across the Atlantic, found their assumptions increasingly untenable. Interrogation files of captured German officers frequently contain expressions of astonishment at the sheer volume of equipment encountered on the Western Front. One general, in a captured message, remarked on the endless stream of American trucks, a stark contrast to his own forces' reliance on horse-drawn transport for a significant portion of their supplies. This disparity in logistical capacity had profound strategic implications. Allied commanders could plan offensives with the assurance of sustained supply, allowing for deeper penetrations and more aggressive maneuvers. German forces, by contrast, were constantly constrained by their limited and vulnerable supply lines, forcing them to conserve resources and often abandon equipment due to a lack of fuel or recovery assets. The ability to replace losses quickly and maintain operational tempo became a decisive advantage. The industrial and logistical superiority of the Allies transformed the nature of the conflict, turning it into a war of attrition that the Axis powers could not hope to win. Each tank, truck, and bullet delivered to the front line underscored the fundamental imbalance of resources. The inexorable flow of material from Allied factories to the battlefields created a strategic reality that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The Eastern Front, by late 1943, had become a crucible, consuming German resources at an unsustainable rate. Operational reports from Army Group Center documented daily losses of 1,200 tons of material, primarily ammunition and fuel, simply to maintain defensive lines against Soviet offensives. This attrition was not merely a matter of battlefield consumption. It reflected a systemic imbalance between production and expenditure, exacerbated by the sheer scale of the conflict. Simultaneously, the Western and Mediterranean theaters demanded their own substantial allocations. Interrogation files from captured Luftwaffe pilots revealed a growing frustration with fuel rationing, with sortie rates often dictated by available aviation gasoline rather than strategic necessity. The Afrika Korps, even after its retreat, continued to draw on limited shipping capacity for its remnants, diverting resources that could have reinforced the Eastern Front or bolstered homeland air defenses. The strategic implications of this multi-front strain became increasingly evident in production logs. While German industry achieved impressive output in certain sectors, such as tank production reaching 1,800 units per month by early 1944, the overall logistical infrastructure struggled to distribute these assets effectively. Rail networks, already under pressure from Allied bombing, faced bottlenecks at every major junction, delaying critical shipments of spare parts, food, and medical supplies. This logistical overstretch was compounded by the increasing demand for manpower. Wehrmacht personnel records indicated a decline in the average age and experience of frontline infantry, as successive drafts pulled from older age groups and less trained recruits. The need to maintain garrison forces in occupied territories, combined with the heavy casualties on the Eastern Front, stretched the available pool of fighting men to its breaking point, impacting both combat effectiveness and the ability to man the complex logistical chain. The initial German confidence in their ability to wage short, decisive campaigns had blinded many to the long-term implications of sustained, high-intensity warfare. The meticulous planning for rapid advances did not translate into an equally robust system for enduring prolonged attritional struggles across vast distances. The laughter at Allied logistical challenges had faded, replaced by the grim reality of their own supply lines, now stretched thin and increasingly brittle under the weight of an expanding war. Occupied France, August 1943. A single German Army Group Center, Daily Situation Report, filed from the Eastern Front, contained an unusual addendum. Recommendation: cease all non-essential road movements after dusk. This seemingly minor detail, buried within pages of combat statistics, signaled a growing unease, a creeping acknowledgement of vulnerabilities previously dismissed. The laughter, once a common sound in the mess halls of the Wehrmacht, had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet, gnawing anxiety regarding the very arteries that sustained their war machine. The vastness of the Eastern Front, initially perceived as an advantage for maneuver warfare, had become a logistical quagmire. German supply lines, stretching thousands of kilometers from the Reich's industrial heartland, were inherently fragile. Each kilometer, added to the journey, exponentially increased the resources required for transport, maintenance, and protection. The average round trip for a supply convoy from a railhead to a forward fighting unit could exceed 500 kilometers, consuming precious fuel and vehicle life even before reaching its destination. Partisan activity, initially underestimated and dismissed as mere banditry, escalated into a coordinated campaign of sabotage and disruption. Railway lines, critical for bulk transport, became prime targets. A German Army High Command intelligence summary from late 1943 documented an average of 35 successful railway sabotage incidents per week across the occupied Soviet territories, ranging from track removal to bridge demolitions. These attacks, while rarely catastrophic in isolation, forced diversions, delayed shipments, and required constant allocation of combat units for security duties, drawing resources away from the front lines. The attrition of transport vehicles, particularly trucks, became a silent but devastating drain. Production logs from Daimler-Benz and Opel, two primary suppliers of military trucks, showed a consistent shortfall against demand. While new vehicle production averaged 12,000 units per month across all manufacturers in 1943, combat losses, mechanical breakdowns due to poor roads and lack of maintenance, and partisan ambushes collectively accounted for an estimated 15,000 vehicle losses per month on the Eastern Front alone. This created a widening deficit, forcing units to cannibalize damaged vehicles for parts, further reducing operational readiness. Fuel, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, became increasingly scarce. Allied bombing campaigns, particularly against synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr and Silesia, began to impact production by early 1944. A German Air Ministry analysis from March 1944 estimated a 20% reduction in aviation fuel output compared to the previous year, with similar, though less dramatic declines in diesel and gasoline. This forced increasingly stringent rationing, leading to situations where entire armored divisions were ordered to conserve fuel, restricting tactical flexibility and offensive potential. The cumulative effect of these pressures was a gradual, insidious strangulation of the German war effort. Ammunition shortages, once localized and temporary, became more frequent and widespread. Unit diaries from infantry divisions in early 1944 frequently noted restrictions on artillery fire, with some reports detailing limits of as few as 5 rounds per gun per day. This directly impacted their ability to repel Soviet offensives, shifting the tactical advantage decisively. Medical supplies, often considered secondary to ammunition and fuel, also suffered. Field hospital records from the winter of 1943 to 44 showed a marked increase in deaths from preventable infections due to a lack of antibiotics and sterile dressings. Evacuation chains, already strained by distance and poor infrastructure, were further hampered by fuel shortages and vehicle attrition, leading to longer transit times for wounded soldiers and a corresponding decrease in survival rate. The logistical breakdown was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding deterioration. It manifested not in dramatic explosions, but in the quiet, desperate decisions of company commanders to abandon heavy equipment for lack of fuel. in the dwindling rations that left soldiers perpetually hungry, and in the growing stacks of unrepairable vehicles. The initial overconfidence in their own logistical prowess, fueled by early victories, had blinded them to the inherent vulnerabilities of their extended reach. The retreat from the Dnieper in late 1943 and then from the Carpathian Line in early 1944 represented a forced capitulation to the arithmetic of attrition. Divisions once formidable now reported daily truck losses to mechanical failure and partisan ambush at rates exceeding 150 vehicles per 24-hour period, according to 7th Army transport logs. The strategic implications were profound. Without the mobility to counter Soviet thrusts or the tonnage to sustain prolonged engagements, the German defensive posture became increasingly static and vulnerable. The operational breakdown was visible in the field. Fuel allocations, once measured in thousands of liters per division per day for offensive maneuvers, dwindled to barely 200 liters for essential resupply and limited tactical movements, as recorded in Quartermaster General Supply manifests from February 1944. Artillery units once capable of sustained barrages were now restricted to firing only in response to direct enemy attack, often with fewer than 10 rounds per gun per day, based on ammunition expenditure reports from Army Group South. This parsimony transformed the battlefield, granting Soviet forces an overwhelming advantage in preparatory bombardments and maneuverability. The once proud panzer divisions, the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, became increasingly anchored to railheads, their operational radius shrinking dramatically. A panzer division designed to operate 200 kilometers beyond its supply base could now barely manage 50 kilometers before fuel exhaustion. According to analysis of fuel consumption rates and available reserves detailed in OKH operational summaries from March 1944, this logistical strangulation meant that local counterattacks, though often ferocious, lacked the strategic depth to alter the larger operational picture. The infantry, deprived of adequate motor transport, reverted to horse-drawn wagons and forced marches, a mode of movement reminiscent of a bygone era. Unit diaries from the 117th Jaeger Division in April 1944 frequently noted daily marching distances of 30 kilometers, often under constant Soviet air observation, with men carrying their own ammunition and rations due to vehicle shortages. This physical degradation contributed to plummeting morale and an inability to conduct sustained defensive operations against a mechanized and increasingly well-supplied adversary. The cumulative effect of these logistical failures was a strategic paralysis. The ability to concentrate forces for a decisive blow or even to conduct an orderly withdrawal under pressure was severely compromised. The decision to shorten the front lines and abandon vast territories, such as the Crimea in May 1944, was not a strategic choice for improved positioning, but a desperate measure to consolidate dwindling resources, as explicitly stated in Field Marshal Keitel's directives. The cost of maintaining the Crimean garrison, in terms of shipping losses and fuel expenditure, became unsustainable, exceeding 12,000 tons of supplies per week, according to naval transport logs.